Okay, welcome back. In the last previous videos, we demonstrate how we can use namespace versioning, where using the Rest framework application in Django, we can version the URL using the concept of namespacing from Django Rest framework. We demonstrate that with the namespace versioning package or class, the emphasis on versioning the URL is more on naming and include configuration or a URL configuration with the instance namespacing. So in this video, we look at the URLPath versioning, where Django Rest framework required that the URL issued by request have the valid version on the URL. So for the URLPath versioning, Django Rest framework requires that the user pass the version of the URL literally on the path. As we can see that this include the URL configuration has been constrained by the regular expression, which says that for all the URL coming from products application, make sure that they start with either V1 or V2. So to make it simple, the difference between the URLPath versioning scheme and the namespace versioning scheme is that with namespace versioning, the namespace should be appended as a keyword or parameter on the include function, whereas with the URLPath versioning, we need to apply the regular expression that constrains each request issue by this particular URL to have the valid version from the allow version on the configuration. So let's demonstrate and see how we can use the URLPath versioning. Okay, as promised, we should have be talking about the query parameter versioning, but before we talk about the query parameter versioning, we'll be demonstrating the URL path versioning versus the namespace versioning. So with the URL versioning, with the URLPath versioning, the restriction for a URL to be valid, for a given URL to be valid, when the user is issuing the request, the URL should have something like a v1 slash let's say products slash ID or all, whereas we can also use something like a v1 slash products slash all. So the difference when we're using namespace versioning, the consideration is more applied on the namespace keyword that we passed on the include configuration when loading the URL configuration from an app or from the main URL config file. So to demonstrate how we can use the URLPath versioning without using the keyword namespace, let's create a new view set. We name the view set customer view set. We still extend the modded view set. Modded view set. We can, instead of using the main configuration as we did for the namespace versioning, we can apply this particular versioning on the customer view set. To do so, we need to declare a property called versioning class, and we can of course import from REST framework the package versioning and imports our class URLPath Versioning. So we can directly call the URLPath Versioning here on our view to make sure that this particular view will use the scheme URLPath Versioning instead of using the global configuration, which is the namespace versioning. Okay, so we declare our class versioning. Of course, we need to declare the query sets. We call that customer dot objects, and then we can also declare the serializer class, customer serializer. So as you can see, automatically PyCharm cannot recognize customer and customer serializer because they are not defined. So we need to make sure we define them. As always, we start by testing our URL. So we can delete everything from the last tutorial here. Let's start from scratch, or we can just leave it the way it is, create a new class called customer test case. We import the default test case. On setup, we need the URL customer URL v1 from customer, we can name this one from customer v1, and we also need the URL customer URL v2, and we reverse from the URL name customer v2. and start testing. For test is test gets customer URL. Let's print self customer URL v1. Since we have not defined, we don't need to test for customer v2. We can comment customer v2 for now, and let's start testing. So where are we now? We have to go to this manage test policy. Okay, I don't think we need to create this test case here, since I always like to decouple, or I like to decouple entity, which means using the concept of single responsibility. So we have the customer entity. We should create an application that will handle everything about the customer. So we shouldn't put it in the policy application. Therefore, we can cut it, and from our projects, we can Django admin creates an app called customer. Start an app. Yeah, this is not React. Starts app customer. Just one click. We have a new application called customer, and then from inside the test file, we can just from the customer, we can simply paste the test case. Of course, we need to import the reverse from Django shortcuts, import reverse. There we are. We kind of we simply apply the concept of single responsibility, which means we shouldn't be testing customer and policy app. Well, you can do that if you are building a small application, but if your application will grow, it's better to decouple entity class with application. Most importantly, a concept like a customer, we can have customer billing, we can have a lot of things relating to a customer entity. So it's better for us to create an application called customer. Okay, let's go ahead and test that. Python manage test. We can just test customer and get our first error. Okay, customer is not defined, and this is on the view. So we have to go back on policy view where we create the customer view. We can copy that as well. We can delete that. We don't need customer on policy, we need customer on customer. So from REST framework, view sets, import the model view set. From REST framework, imports versioning, or from REST framework versioning, imports the URLPath versioning. So if you run our test again, it's gonna fail. Yeah, now we are exclusively testing the customer v1, so you can say the reverse for customer v1, it's not a valid function pattern, so which means there is no URL name or customer v1, so we need to create one. To do so, we need to create the file named URL.py inside the folder customer. So URL and of course we need an array called pattern and from Django config URL we can import include, we can import URLPath, or we can simply import URL. So we have that. Next, we also need to import Django URL. From Django URL, we import we can either use the URL or use the path. So let's just comment this. So we got URL, run URL, so starting from customers, so the URL start from customer. This is a sub URL. You see, we need the handler customer view sets, and we have the so and then we need the handler customer view set, which is now defined. Of course, we need to import from imports customer view set. So the customer view set is defined now. So make sure that this one, the variable needed by Django is the URL patterns. Yeah. Okay, so next we need to test. So the customer v1 still now defined. We can we need to import the customer URL on the main configuration. We can also create something like we can create we can create a variable called URL and pass it under the URL pattern, but let's just import the main URL here. Next, we need to import the URL configuration on the main URL configuration file from the customer URL. So we can use path, and let's use something like customer customer include customer.url. Yeah, so we include customer.url, and let's try to test again, and we can name. So right here we just create a new path or customer that include all URL from customers, as we can see on the URL path here. So what we trying to build here, so we're building something like a customer slash customer. So which means on the main configuration customer, we import the customer URL from the app customers. Something like this. Okay, let's try to test again, see if we can get name. Okay, we got a new error. Customer is now defined, which means Django kind of recognize this URL as a valid URL, but as soon as it gets to the URL configuration, it can now, as soon as it gets to URL configuration, it's the customer view set, it cannot find the model customer. So we got define model customer. So I can create a class called customer from model, create a model customer. We're just gonna create a first name, which is model, chart field, max length, something like 24, last name, model, chart field, max length, something like 28. Of course, we create a model, we need to make migration. Maybe, of course, there are a lot of feed we can define for the entity customer, but maybe age, model, integer feed, yeah, just null, false. Okay, something like this, pretty simple. Null, false, false. If we be using Django form, we can say blank. For Django admin, we can say blank false 2 and blank false. Okay, so let's make migration. Python manage make migrations. Okay, customer seed not defined, so we cannot make migration because we need to make sure that the pre-check system pass. Therefore, we gotta import the customer here from this package model imports customer. I'm pretty sure we need to create a serializer too, but let's continue testing. Okay, the application customer is now declared in the install apps, which means as soon as we create the app, we need to make sure that we pass it in the settings. So let's add the application customer here. Add the application customer. Let's continue testing, make migration. Now the serializer is now defined. We need to define serializer. To do so, we got to create a new file called serializer. And we can name it anything, but and import our serializer. First, we need to create a class called customer serializer. What are we gonna use? We need to use from Rest framework serializer import model serializer. So from model serializer, define the subclass meta field. We're gonna use all field from customer. The model, we're gonna use customer, and of course we need to import customer from this package model import customer. Okay. Customer serializer is still not defined. We need to define customer serializer on view sets. So from this package serializer import customer serializer. Okay, now we create our new migration. The best way to build application is to understand small concepts of whatever tool you are using, whether it's a framework or a library. Just want to understand basic concepts. The basic concept of Django Rest framework is serializer, model, and the view handler. So we create our migration file. Now we can migrate that. Manage migrates. So the migrates creates a new table for us. Now we can continue testing. Okay, Python test customer. We still have the error that customer view on is now considered. So let's look at our test. What are we looking for here? So we're looking for any URL that is named customer view on. If we go look at the customer URL configuration, we don't see any URL name customer v1. If we go on policy URL, we don't see any URL configuration name customer v1. So we need to name one of our URL, and we're gonna do that on customer configuration. Name equal customer v1. So now we have our customer v1. We can test. Yeah, it's passing now. So we have customer and customers. So this is a valid URL. So we have a valid URL. Are we really meeting the requirements for the versioning class URLPath, or the URLPath versioning? I'm not sure, because every time we issue our request, we should have something. We should have make a distinction between. Okay, let's try something. Let's go on our URL. Let's say we create a new URL. We name that, these are the same configuration. When someone issue to customers, they will land on this request will be ended by customer view set. But we just name the second one v2 and see what's gonna happen. Let's test. So it retained customer. So basically we cannot tell the difference between the customer name v1 and customer name v2. Moreover, to make sure that our request, our URL will contain a version, we can check requests by using a list. Let's print something, request version, and from we can also pass the response. So we need to call from Django or from Rest framework, response imports response. So we can retain our response here, response, which is gonna be a dictionary, a JSON response. We call it data response from customer. Of course, we wouldn't return a data. We need to return query sets from the customer model. But for the sake of this tutorial, since we want to demonstrate versioning instead of demonstrating how you can retrieve data from your database, we just return a response with a content type application JSON. So the goal for calling list here is to make sure our requests contain versioning, since we're using the versioning class for this particular view set. So we are not issuing a request up to now. We're just printing the URL. Let's create a new test. Gets version from requests. So we need to issue a request. We have a response set. clients get self customer v1. Yeah, that's all. Let's see what's gonna happen. Manage test customer test. It's better for us just to use tag, you know, we can use tag, so we can tag our specific test. It's, you know, decorator testing now, tag equal testing now. So we'll be testing this one. We are not printing anything, so we need to make sure that we print our response contents. Okay, so there are a bunch of error will be, you know, we've seen here. So inits cannot be, you know, so type error init takes one position argument by two were given. What's happening? So what's happening here is that we are now calling the response, we are now calling the handler on the view set. So let's go on the URL configuration. This view set has to have as view, which is where the magic happen. So we need to pass get is handle by list. That's the only way we can get this error pass, because we don't issue a request on init. So now we got a new error. We say expect response or HTTP response but to be retained from the list by the receiver class non-type. So there's something wrong with our list here. So we calling a response instead of returning a response. So we got return a response. Let's continue testing. Okay, we got something. Now we have a default. So we have a default v1.0, and this v1.0 is the namespace versioning. As you can see in our main setting, we said we configure the versioning class to be the namespace versioning. Whereas for this particular tutorial, we're talking about the URLPath version, which restricts all URL to have the version, you know. So for the URL path versioning, each URL issued by a user should have the version, something like a v customer / customers. So we can get the v1. If we get the v.0, it's now, we are now using the correct restriction. Everything can go fine, but it doesn't mean that everything is okay. everything can be working. You can build your application, it's working, but it's not really working. If you go test that, you will discover that it's not really working. So as we can see here, we didn't pass the URL we didn't pass any version in our URL. Now did we try to pass a version here in the main configuration for customer? So what are we receiving the v1? The v1 is now the URLPath versioning. The v1 is the default version for our global configuration coming from the namespace versioning. So to make a distinction between the namespace versioning versions and the actual version that we are expecting from customer, we have to restrict, we have to define the version on the URL. As the name suggests, it's called the URLPath versioning, not the namespace versioning. So to do so, it's simply we need to repath a regular expression. We need to apply a regular expression on this URL saying, hey, when someone issue a URL, when someone issue a request using this URL configuration, we want all URL to start with keywords, the keyword start name version that contain either version 1 or version 2. So what's happening here? So we restricting the validity of this URL. For this URL to be valid, we need to use a regular expression. So if there is something you can retain from this video, the distinction between the namespace versioning and the URLPath versioning is that with the namespace versioning, Django give more emphasis using the keyword value namespace on the include configuration, whereas for the URLPath versioning, the emphasis is more on the regular expression, which makes sure that the value, the string version, contain either the v1 or the v2. Or you can also dynamically generate this or expression, by loading something like a read a file. You can read a file that retain a list of version and automatically pass it here, so that the regular expression can check that the URL issue for this configuration should have all the version available from your file, which is out of the scope for this tutorial. We just want to demonstrate that this URL should have a v1 or v2. So let's continue testing and see what's going to happen. Okay, now we got a new error. So what's happening here is that the reverse customer one with no arguments not found. Pardon, try v1 or v2 customer. So what's happening here is that we are looking for any URL named customer v1. And for customer V1 to be found, our URL configuration has to receive a keywords name version which should have a value by either V1 or V2. So we can't get one. So why can't we get one? As we can see in the main configuration, we do have the namespace versioning, and this scheme, should I have said, as a set of allow version that or a URL should have when you're using the namespace versioning. This is the global configuration. In our instance, where when using the customer app, we are using the URLPath versioning. But what's going on here? Let's test again and see what's happening. So we get the same error, when we try to reverse the URL name customer V1. Django can recognize, yeah, I do have Django can recognize, yeah, I do have a URL name customer V1, and unfortunately, this URL is handled by a view set called customer view set, and this customer view set require that you use a versioning class with valid version using the class URLPath Versioning. And these required valid version should be either V1 or V2. This error will happen. It's better to deal with such error, because that's the only way you can know what's really going on. So what's happening here, although we have imported the URLPath versioning from the versioning package in Django, but there is no default versioning such as V1 and V2 as a set of default version, the way the namespace versioning has been using that here in the global configuration. So we need to define our own set of allowed version that the class or URLPath versioning will be using it. So there is no V1, V2 on this particular class by default. So to do so, we need to extend this class, creating our customized versioning. So let's create a new customized class that extends our property of URLPath versioning. So we create a new directory called versioning. We can lowercase refactor, rename, okay, and so we can create a new class. Let's make it a package first, and let's create a new class. We call that customer versioning, and we can create our class name customer URLPath versioning, and this will extend from REST framework versioning, imports URLPath versioning, So we extend URLPath versioning. Now we need to define the default set of version. So which is a property called allow version. So we allow v1 and v2, and the default version of course is v1. The version parameter that we need to accept is version, because this should be this version parameter that we are calling. It should not, it really doesn't matter, but you need to make sure the name appearing here on the version parameter should be the same with the one you are expecting from your query parameter in the regular expression constraints. So this regular expression tells the URL, hey, I need you to send keywords with a key version that contain either v1 or v2 when reversing on this particular URL. So we create our customized URLPath versioning. We define the default variable version. Now let's import that. So to import that, we need to go on view, and from our view, instead of using the directly the URLPath versioning, we're gonna import our customized URL. So from here, versioning, in the customer versioning file, import class customer URLPath versioning, and that's the class that we'll be using for this particular view set. Bear in mind that the version that we use in our URLPath versioning are totally different, even if that's not the way we should do that when creating a big application that extend. But I wanted to make sure that I demonstrate the difference between the global versioning that apply on default requests, and then all the requests that goes to the customer view sets. So for this view set, we expect a version, a URL to have a v1 instead of a URL to have a v.0. So yeah, so we have our customized URLPath versioning. We import that on the view, we pass that on the property versioning class. Now let's test and see what's happened. Yeah, we see get the same error. Where are we getting the same error? Because when we're trying to reverse on this URL name, we are not passing a keywords name version that I have a value either v1 or v2. So we need to comma when we're reversing keyword arguments, pass a dictionary with a key version, and we pass v1. Now let's test again. There we go. Now you can see the difference between the namespace versioning and the URLPath versioning. So the URLPath versioning expect from the user, the requester, to send a value. So to send a v1 on the URL, So the expectation, if we can even print let's print the URL so we can know what's going on, the difference. So as you can see, it automatically appends when we call gets me the URL name v1 or the URL name customer underscore v1, which is this URL. And I want to get v1, the URL v1. You know, when I pass the key version, I want to get the v1 and automatically append. So this will be the valid URL for this particular view set. Okay guys, I think I have to stop here for now. As far as the URLPath versioning, you know, normally I should have been talking about the query parameter versioning. I had to make a distinction between URLPath versioning and the namespace versioning. So in the next video, I'll be talking about the query parameter versioning. You know, the query parameter versioning, where we need to issue our requests such that we can have the path and the path to with query parameter version equal v1 or v2 or v3, something like this. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.